In this video, we're going to talk about how compounds change. There are two different types of changes that a compound can undergo. It can undergo a chemical change or a physical change. So let's first talk about a physical change. A physical change is where the compound itself does not change at all. The identity of the compound is always the same. So there are no bonds broken, no bonds are formed. It's the same compound. The other type of change that a substance can undergo is a chemical change. A chemical change is where a compound or substance actually changes. It turns into something brand new. So for that to happen, bonds have to be formed or broken for a chemical change. Now, the most common physical change is a phase change. A phase change is whenever the substance changes phase. So it goes from a solid to a liquid in the case of melting, or if we're boiling water, going from a liquid to a gas. Those are all examples of phase changes, and those are physical changes. In the case of evaporating the water, water is still going from a liquid phase to a gas phase. It's not changing. It's still the same compound. It's still H2O molecule. The actual compound isn't changing itself. We still have water molecules in the liquid phase, and they're just more energy is being applied to it, and they separate to go into the gas phase. The second type of change is a chemical change. The chemical change is when we actually have a brand new substance that is formed. Now, how do we know a chemical change has taken place? Well, whenever a chemical change happens, it's what we call a chemical reaction. And so the way we know chemical reactions take place is there may be a color change. So if you have a substance and it changes color, there's a possibility that there was a chemical change that substance undergone. There could also be a change in the smell. For example, milk. If milk sits out for a long period of time, it will end up souring. And so that is a chemical change that's happening. The milk is changing. Also, we can have a change in the energy. So energy can go into the system or it can leave. So if something gets really warm, then that means energy went into it. And so that is what we call an endothermic reaction. So the substance got really warm, energy went into it. And so that is a example of a chemical change that happened. Also, if energy escaped in the form of heat, then that is what we would call an exothermic reaction. And so for that to happen, a substance had to undergo, bonds had to be broken, bonds had to be formed for that energy to be released in an exothermic reaction. And so when that happened, that was a chemical change. Also, another way we know a chemical reaction or a chemical change has happened is that bubbles are forming. The best example is Alka-Seltzer tablets. You throw some Alka-Seltzer tablets in some water, you get some bubbles forming. Those bubbles are an example of a chemical change. Another example would be if you ever did a maybe second or third grade science experiment mixing baking soda and vinegar, making a homemade volcano. Whenever you mix the baking soda and vinegar, bubbles form, and those bubbles is an example or are indicative of a chemical reaction or a chemical change. In that case, carbon dioxide gas is being made. The last way we know a chemical change has taken place is if a precipitate has formed. A precipitate is a solid. So if you mix two things together and a solid is formed, that solid is what we call a precipitate, and you've done a precipitation reaction. So the way we know a chemical change has taken place is there may be a color change, there may be a change in the smell, there may be a change in temperature, there could be a gas formed, so we can see evidence of bubbles forming, or there may be a solid that forms in the case of a precipitation reaction. Now, just because those changes happen, that does not necessarily mean a chemical reaction has taken place. Because, for example, when we're boiling a pot of water on the stove, we're turning that liquid water into gas and we see bubbles form. That is not a chemical change that's happening. That is a physical change. So if you see a chemical change, you usually have to do another experiment or you have to investigate it further just to really see if it's actually a chemical change. But for the most part, if there's a chemical change, if there's a color change, a change in smell, change in temperature, bubbles are forming, or a solid is formed, then you almost guaranteed a chemical change has taken place.